you very much, Jan, for that generous introduction and this wonderful invitation. Such a pity I can't be there in Prague. The book is actually being published next Tuesday by Yale, a little earlier than you thought. So, how Republican was the Constitution of the 3rd of May, 1791? That day, the Sejm, or Parliament of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Rzeczpospolita, acclaimed a secretly prepared and suddenly introduced project, the Law on Government, the Ustawa Rządowa. Statute laws passed by the Sejm were called constitutions, konstytucja. But however, this law soon took on another meaning of constitution, a solemn legal framework, usually in the form of a single written document outlining a country's form of government and the relationship between citizens and government, the whole being derived from the fundamental values shared by the community. An almanac published a few months later compared 4 constitutions: the English, which served others as a model, the American, which was formed from it, the Polish, which made use of both, and in the end, the French, which has had these 3 models together before it. A similar argument had been made on the 3rd of May, 1791 by the Marshal or Speaker of the Sejm, Stanisław August. However, he spoke of a republican government, rząd republikański, which could also be translated as a republican form of government. Quote, among others in this century, we have the 2 most famous republican governments. That is, the English government and the American, which corrects the faults of the former, but above them, the one which we are to establish today will be more perfect, for it combines in itself whatever in either of them could be best and most appropriate to our form. Not everyone was convinced. Critics of the Constitution claimed that it transformed the free Commonwealth with its republican government into a monarchy. Some warned of absolutism or despotism. Jan Suchorzewski hysterically threatened to kill his own son rather than let him grow up in slavery. Presumably, he was not thinking of his own serfs. He reportedly announced that he would emigrate to America, only to change his mind when he learned about the strong powers of the presidency. Catherine II, on hearing the news from Warsaw, complained that the Sejm had conferred arbitrary power on the King of Poland. Critics continued to lament that the Constitution had, quote, destroyed the sovereignty of the Commonwealth, overthrown liberty, torn away the nation's freedoms, and transformed the free Commonwealth into a monarchy. It was all the more important, therefore, to convince the Commonwealth's nobility or szlachta that their republican government was safe. Among those recruited to the cause was Edmund Burke, whose praise of the Polish Revolution, in contrast to the revolution in France, was translated and published. When the time came, in February 1792, to obtain a vote of confidence from the local assemblies, or sejmiki, the Commonwealth's leading preacher, Michał Karpowicz, claimed during a barnstorming sermon that zealous English Republican, Mr. Burke, could hardly find the words in marveling at this law before all Europe. It worked. Participants in 4/5 of all the local assemblies in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania swore to uphold and defend the Constitution. Enthusiasm was more muted in some parts of the Polish crown, but not a single Sejmik in the Commonwealth criticized the law on government. Contemporaries had no doubt. This was a decisive endorsement by the nation. A handful of malcontents gathered in St. Petersburg to supplicate the Empress Catherine to restore their free Commonwealth. Responding in the Sejm on the 21st of May, 1792, to the declaration that accompanied the Russian invasion of Poland-Lithuania, King Stanisław August insisted that, quote, the essence of our law on government does not in the least overthrow either liberty or the republican state. The word he used for state was stan, also used for estate. His brother, Primate Michał Poniatowski, tried to persuade Catherine that the current order of things in Poland was so close to the heart of the nation and ultimately only shows reforms strictly subordinated to republican principles. It was to no avail. The Russian army installed a counter-revolutionary clique in power. Stanisław August had to recant his part in the revolutionary Warsaw Sejm and confess before the Republican nation that the desire for novelty and new maxims, dangerous for the tranquility of nations, daring to crush almost completely the timeless laws of the Commonwealth, sought to transform Poland into a monarchical democratic government. The democratic element in the pot was the alleged spread of Jacobin maxims. Neither the Empress nor her collaborators were bothered by the incongruity. It is not surprising, given the Republican discourse of the Szlachta, that so many of the contemporary polemics about the Constitution of the 3rd of May should have concerned whether or not a Republican government had been transformed into a monarchy. As generations passed, however, the question lost its urgency. This was mainly because the reputation of the Commonwealth plummeted, and that was partly because of the justifications spread by the partitioning powers, and partly because many Poles blamed the fall of the Commonwealth on its anarchic Szlachta. For some, however, the Constitution had heralded a better future. The Constitution of the 3rd of May, wrote the nationalist ideologue Roman Dmowski, is, quote, the expression of two truly Polish aspirations of the Reform Party, which was patriotic not only in name. The first of these was the extension of political rights, bringing new elements to political life, giving the Reform Party a democratic character. The second, increasing the duties of the citizen with regard to the state, the strengthening of government, the establishment of a dynasty, in a word, a reaction to the monstrous political liberalism of noble society, giving the party an étatiste character, and as we would say today, a national one. Well, that remedy sounds remarkably like a monarchical democratic government. These days, the standard characterization remains that coined in the 1980s by Emanuel Rostworowski, having earlier revealed in a masterclass of the historian's craft the drafting of the law on government as a compromise between King Stanisław August, the enlightened aristocratic Nazi Potocki, the gifted ideologue Hugo Kołłątaj, with some help from Małachowski. He pronounced the 15 months in which the Constitution was in force the year of constitutional monarchy. And that, by most historians of the Commonwealth, is considered a good thing, until recently. Stanisław August has often been criticized for repeatedly yielding to Russia, although many have argued that the consequences of resistance would almost always have been worse. The King's efforts to strengthen the monarchy so that the Commonwealth would approach the British formula of the King in Parliament have generally been appreciated by his detractors as well as his admirers. Some historians have regretted that the Constitution of the 3rd of May was not more monarchist, although others have appreciated its judicious blend of monarchism and republicanism. That consensus has changed in the current century. Andrzej Sulima-Kamiński, probably the Commonwealth's most influential global advocate, has alleged that the King prevented the agreement of a progressive republican form of government, extending the Commonwealth's own civic traditions. According to Kamiński, the Constitution was spoilt by imported monarchism, and many nobles were driven by a royal plot to support the counter-revolutionary Confederacy of Targowica. Explanations have come full circle. So, how republican was the Constitution of the 3rd of May? When I quote from the text, I shall generally follow the translation made in 1791 by the Polish minister in London. When that is misleading, I shall translate from the best scholarly edition by Anna Grzeszkowiak-Krwawicz, who has greatly advanced our understanding of the Constitution. The text is brief, just under 3,700 words. It is structured as an invocation and a preamble, 11 articles, and a conclusory declaration of the assembled estates, which is concerned with the Constitution's propagation and implementation. The first article concerns religion and toleration. The next 3 deal with the social order. The next 4 introduce and outline the legislative, executive, and judicial powers. The next 2 concern arrangements for a regency and the education of royal children. And the 11th is about the armed forces. More detailed provisions were left to subsequent laws or were referred to previous ones, notably that on free royal towns passed 2 weeks earlier, which was incorporated into the Constitution. Judgments on the law on government cannot be separated from the corpus of constitutional legislation in 1791 to 92. That applies both to language and to content. Let's start with language. a language that is extraordinarily didactic, like a sermon. The stirring rhetoric of national salvation and eloquent archaisms are mixed with innovations. One of the earliest complaints made by critics of the law on government was that they could not find the word Rzeczpospolita in the text. In fact, it features twice. On both occasions, it includes territory, the states of the Commonwealth. This also shows that the meaning of the Polish word państwo still had some way to go in its evolution from its root in dominion to a recognizably modern state. The word for estate, we recall, was stan. In the Constitution, this term is used for the noble estate, stan szlachecki, as well as in the plural form stany, to denote the parliamentary estates assembled in the Sejm. Nevertheless, it will be easy to miss the word Commonwealth. Instead, we find nation, naród, 31 times, the fatherland, ojczyzna, 12 times, the country, kraj, 6 times, and Poland, Polska, 6 times. In 4 cases, nations appear in the plural, and just once in the declaration do we find the 2 nations. Likewise, only the declaration contains in the territories, państwa, of the Polish crown and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The title of Grand Duke of Lithuania figures twice, once in the royal titles and once in a confirmation of nobles' privileges. The adjectives national, narodowy, and Polish, polski, figure 11 and 14 times respectively. It is clear that the authors of the text chose to write about the Polish nation rather than the Commonwealth. This usage was probably intended to facilitate the future evolution of the political community of noble citizens associated with the Rzeczpospolita into a Polish nation that could encompass all inhabitants of the shared fatherland. An earlier outline proposal for the form of government had already used the open-ended word nation, but suspicious parliamentarians had insisted that the term be corrected to the Commonwealth or the noble estate. After the 3rd of May 1791, however, the laws describing the legislative, executive, and judicial institutions used a more traditional vocabulary. Like many proclamations, these laws referred to the Commonwealth and to the 2 nations of the Polish Crown and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. This was partly because they did not have the same persuasive functions as the law on government, but also because they could more easily be amended. Besides the nation, the Constitution's other leitmotifs were independence, government, and liberty. The word independence, niepodległość, appears just once, but the defense of the nation or fatherland or country and its borders is emphasized a further 9 times. Moreover, the preamble, the declaration, and the justification of hereditary succession all contain clauses directed against foreign powers' interference. The preservation of the country's independence, sovereignty, and frontiers required the restoration of government, rząd. This word, which can also mean order, is used no less than 17 times, although the second article guarantees nobles' property against the incursions of government and qualifies it as a free government. Wolność, liberty or freedom, figures 12 times in the text, once in the plural. The adjective free, wolny, appears 13 times. Adjectival and adverbial variants of voluntary, dobrowolny, are used 4 times, usually regarding peasants' rights. Freedom, in the singular, is left unqualified 4 times, but is thrice qualified by obywatelska, civic or civil, and once each by internal, personal, complete, national, and true. The frequency with which liberty was invoked might reassure those who were anxious about freedom was henceforth to be understood. The apparent purpose of the second article was to reassure nobles that their privileges and liberties were secure, but especially emphatic was the guarantee to every individual of, quote, personal liberty and security of territorial and movable property from the least encroachment on either by the supreme national power, as we regard the preservation of personal security and property as by law ascertained to be a tie of society and the very essence of civil liberty, which ought to be considered and respected forever. This emphasis reflected the changing understanding and language of liberty in the later 18th century, with a greater emphasis on property. It also links to the restriction of the political rights of landless nobles. The heart of the Constitution is its 5th article, form of government or the definition of public powers. It blended an old assumption expressed in the vigorous language of Rousseau, as we've heard from my predecessor, with Montesquieu's tripartition of powers. All power in civil society should be derived from the will of the nation, its end and object being the integrity of the territories, civil liberty, and the good order of society on an equal scale and on a lasting foundation. 3 distinct powers shall compose the government of the Polish nation according to the present constitution, viz. First, legislative power in the estates assembled. Second, executive power in the king and the custodial council. Third, judicial power in the jurisdictions existing or to be established. The threefold purpose of power loosely corresponded to the 3 types of power. Of these 3 powers, the legislative was the highest. The legislature could interfere in the work of the executive, but not vice versa, provisions strengthened in subsequent laws, which also chipped away at the royal prerogatives of nomination, legislative initiative, and clemency. The 7th article of the Constitution, having explained the disastrous consequences of neglecting the executive power, consigned it to the king in the custodial council of the laws, but only after having secured to the free Polish nation the right of enacting laws, the power of inspection over all executive power, and the choice of officials. That power also extended to the election by citizens or their representatives of almost all judges in courts of the first, second, and final instances. The title of the 6th article, the same or the legislative power, announced that legislative power was not to be delegated upwards by the Sejmiki. Crucially, because the legislative power cannot be exercised by all, and the nation acts in this regard through its representatives or freely elected envoys, we enact that envoys elected at Sejmiki shall in the legislature and the general needs of the nation be considered as representatives of the entire nation, in them reposing our trust. Without explicitly saying so, instructions given by Sejmiki to their envoys lost their imperative force, a change which the Sejm had very recently rejected. The elevation of the Chamber of Envoys as the representation and composition of the supreme national authority entailed a reduction in the powers of the Senate. Both on the 3rd of May and afterwards, the fiercest controversy was provoked by the introduction of hereditary succession to the throne. The claim that it was merely elective by families fooled nobody. Even the text justified the decision to grant the Polish throne with the right of succession by enumerating the fatal effects of interregna. This change was denounced as incompatible with a republican government, but many vehemently disagreed. During the debate on the 3rd of May, Ignacy Zakrzewski declared that the election of kings was, quote, never a prerogative of liberty, but always fatal to it, a feast at which magnates gorged themselves. He knew, quote, no other liberty essential for a republican in a republican government that when he himself makes the law and he is himself subject to nothing but the law. And that, I think, gets to the heart of the matter. It pithily expresses the principle of non-domination. Nothing in the Constitution of the 3rd of May or subsequent legislation undermined lawmaking by the elected representatives of the political community or the subjection of all, including the monarch, to the law. There was certainly a tendency in later 18th century Polish political discourse, influenced by Montesquieu and encouraged by Stanisław August, to highlight the abuses perpetrated by magnates on individuals' freedom. A stronger executive power, headed by the monarch with significant prerogatives, was a key part of the remedy. But the other essentials were a more effective legislature and judicial system. And this is why I would prefer to characterize the king's preferred form of government as a limited and parliamentary monarchy. It could be called proto-liberal, but it was compatible with neo-Roman republicanism. The essential conditions for republican liberty remained: fundamental rights and citizens' participation in the making of laws. Moreover, the path was cleared for the extension by degrees of personal liberty to all inhabitants of the country and of political participation to all property holders. The monarch's insistence that the essence of our law on government does not in the least overthrow either liberty or the republican state was not mere propaganda. In reinforcing and extending the essence of republican liberty, the Constitution of the 3rd of May fitted the Commonwealth to meet the challenges of the 19th century, if by some miracle it had survived. Thank you.